Hi. Now in this tutorial what I want to do is introduce you to something called a complex conjugate. If you've got a complex number, say z, and it equals a plus or minus bi, then the complex conjugate of z, often denoted by z with a little star up here, is equal to a minus or plus bi. In other words, what we do is we just switch the sign on the imaginary part. So for instance, if we had a complex number, say z equals 3 plus 5i, then the complex conjugate of z, z star, is equal to 3 minus 5i. We keep the real part exactly the same, but just switch the sign on the imaginary part. If you had, for instance, say z equaled minus 2 minus 3i, then the complex conjugate z star of z would be minus 2 plus 3i. Even if you had just an imaginary part to your complex number, like say z equal minus 2i, then the complex conjugate of that, z star, would be 2i. When you've got a complex number and its complex conjugate, we often call this a complex conjugate pair. So this is a complex conjugate pair, and the same applies to this. Now, when we have complex numbers and their complex conjugate, two things happen that are very special that we can use later on, as you'll find out in later tutorials. And that is, if we add two complex conjugate pairs together, then we always get a real number. Look, z plus z star, if we were to add these two together, 3 plus 5i plus 3 minus 5i, then what happens is the 5i's cancel one another out, and you've just got 3 plus 3, which is 6. And if you were to multiply the two complex conjugate pairs together, z multiplied by the complex conjugate of z, we end up with doing 3 plus 5i in this example multiplied by 3 minus 5i. And if you expand this, you've got 3 times 3, which is 9. Then you've got 3 times minus 5i, which is minus 15i. 5i times 3, which is plus 15i. And plus 5i multiplied by minus 5i, well, that's minus 25i squared, which is plus 25. And what we end up with is that we get 9 plus 25, which is 34. The 15i's cancel one another out. So you get a real number again. You might like to just try these two, just as a short exercise. Check out that if you add these two together, you get a real number, and if you multiply them together, you get a real number. And the same with this. Just pause the video for a moment and come back when ready, and I'll run through the solutions to these. Okay, let's see how you got on if you had a go. So if you were to add these two together, we'd have z plus z star. Well, that's going to be minus 2 minus 2, which is minus 4, and minus 3i plus 3i, well, that disappears to 0. So you end up with a real number, minus 4. And when it comes to doing z multiplied by z star, then you should find that you get minus 2 times minus 2, which is 4. You get minus 6i plus 6i, so that cancels, and you're going to get minus 9i squared, which turns out to be plus 9. 4 and 9 then gives you that real number, 13. And for this one, z plus z star, well, that's simply 0. and when it comes to multiplying them, z multiplied by z star, the complex conjugate of z, gives us simply 4. Alright? Now in my next tutorial I'll show you how we can use the complex conjugate to do division. Alright?